thankful that you could join us here today for our panel discussion on assessing the state of American democracy. This discussion, I think, is pretty well timed, as here we are the day after Election Day, but of course with a lot of uncertainty surrounding not only the presidential election, but some other important elections as well. So we're looking forward to having our panel talk to us about this and what they can tell us from what they've observed with their training and their expertise. Let me just remind you that our lecture series is ongoing, and that next week we will have another one. The speaker next week will be David Schwendeman, who is an attorney who has also spent extensive time working as a war crimes prosecutor in Eastern Europe. And he's going to talk about what he's learned about democracy and so on, with that kind of effort to hold people accountable and to ensure justice. So that should be very interesting as well. But what we will do right now is we will begin with an opening prayer, as is our custom at BYU. This will be offered by Elizabeth Currett, who's an environmental science major from Kingsbury, Texas. So Elizabeth, if you unmute yourself and offer the prayer, please.
Okay. Our dear Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for this opportunity we have to be here together over Zoom today and to learn together. We're grateful for this opportunity to learn from Professor Davis, Professor Monson, Professor Patterson. We ask that Thy Spirit might be with us during this panel discussion, that we can all learn together. We ask that it bless our country and bless the world, that we may all be wise in our decisions, and bless that this election may go well and be peaceful. We're thankful for this gospel that we have in our lives and for the hope that comes from having a Savior. And we say these things in His name, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. All right, thank you. I will now turn the time over to Quinn Meekum. Quinn is also a professor of political science, and he is also our Middle Eastern Studies Arabic coordinator. He'll be moderating this discussion, although he's going to need to leave at a certain point because of other obligations, and so then he'll just turn it over to me. But anyway, Quinn, now to you.
Thanks very much, Stan. Thank you for everyone who's joined us today. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce a few colleagues that I admire a great deal. We have three panelists today. Richard Davis, who is a professor of political science here at Brigham Young University. He's a former director of BYU's Office of Civic Engagement. He's the author of several relevant books, including New Media in American Politics, The Web of Politics, The Internet's Impact on the American Political System, Campaigning Online, and Supreme Democracy, The End of Elitism in the Supreme Court Nomination Process. He's the editor also of a brand new book called Beyond Donkeys and Elephants, Minor Political Parties in Contemporary American Politics. Quinn Monson is also with us. He's an associate professor of political science here at BYU. He is the new director of BYU's Office of Civic Engagement. He received his PhD from Ohio State and teaches and does research on a wide variety of things, including public opinion, campaigns and elections, survey research methods, and religion and politics. Kelly Patterson is our third panelist. He's professor in the Department of Political Science as well. His research interests include campaigns and elections, public opinion, and political parties. Lots for these folks to say. Professor Patterson also worked on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. as a congressional fellow with the American Political Science Association, and he's a former chair of the Department of Political Science, director of the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy, and was an associate dean in the College of Family, Home, and Social Sciences here at BYU. So we've instructed our panelists to take a few minutes to introduce some initial thoughts they have on the topic of the current state of American democracy. Just for your information, Richard Davis is still working to log in. We do hope to have him with us as well. But I'd like to start by turning some time to you, Quinn, and then we'll also hear from Kelly Patterson.
Well, thanks. I'm glad to be here, and the topic is a little bit amorphous, but I think what I want to talk about is how to think about the election results, or maybe the lack of results that we have at the moment. I just checked the latest AP calls to see if we had any progress, and it doesn't look like we're quite there yet, but we may be there to something more definitive later in the day or this evening, it sounds like. But I want to step back and think more broadly along the lines I've been thinking about, and what's occurred to me in the last few weeks as I've watched the election season in 2020 wind down to this point. And what I'll offer is that it's brought into focus for me the importance of our norms of democracy. And for the students on the here that are wondering, what do I mean by norms? Let me explain. Let me step back and even explain more broadly what norms are. So when we, in political science, and I think sociologists talk about this as well, when we talk about norms, we can contrast them with institutions. And I think about norms as versus institutions in terms of institutions being the laws or the rules of the game. So when we have elections, we have election law. We have our Constitution that sets the foundation for the election, that includes the Electoral College and grants powers to Congress and the states to set up the elections. And then we have election laws that are mostly state focused and state by state, and we have a very decentralized system in our country. And those laws can only take us so far. So what I've come to realize is that if there's a weakness in our system, or if there's a sensitive or part of our system, it's that we also not only depend on laws to sustain our democracy, but we depend on norms of good democratic behavior. And what I mean by norms then are things that are not codified in law, but are widely accepted as good behavior, good practice. So for example, I think it's a norm of American elections and elections in a lot of places around the world that you wait until the votes are counted enough to achieve some consensus about a winner, usually through the press in some way, before claiming victory and before conceding defeat. So that's an important norm that we have a lot of candidates from both parties that follow that and have followed that for years and years. So we have candidates that can be impatient with the press. Sometimes they get mad about it. Sometimes they are not happy about waiting or about delays, but they still wait, right? They still wait, and they don't claim victory until the votes have been counted and there is a broad consensus about the winner. And the best example I can point to historically for this is the 2000 presidential election in Florida, where on election night, for those that were not born yet or too young to remember, we had a call that was made in the press in, I think shortly after midnight Eastern time. I may be a little fuzzy on the details, but at some point they called the race for George W. Bush. And then within a couple of hours, they realized that the outcome in Florida was not as clear as everyone thought, and they retracted that call. So George Bush went out and claimed victory, and Al Gore conceded after they thought the election was over, and then it became clear that that wasn't the case. And both candidates behaved, I think, rather well in terms of the norms of retracting their concession and sort of allowing the process to play out. And it played out over weeks. I remember as a graduate student being glued to CNN for several weeks and following the details of this. And I can't say that all of the behavior in that process was the best by either side. I think there was some behavior in Florida that is not admirable, but at least we know that they waited until there was an outcome. And when the Supreme Court weighed in with Bush v. Gore, that effectively stopped the counting where it was at that point, and it led to Bush being named the victor. Al Gore at that point conceded, I think, against some advice from others. Okay, and we saw that countered last night by President Trump in a way that I think is damaging. So at some point after I faded off to sleep, he gave a speech and basically claimed victory when he had no business doing so and still has no business doing so. So I think he's in a long string of norm violations. He's violated yet another norm. Okay, and that's damaging. And I think another norm he's violated, and another way that it brings into focus for me the importance of norms, is that he has made broad claims about election fraud, especially widespread election fraud, with absolutely no evidence of that. So if you're going to make claims about malfeasance in elections or fraud in some way, you need some evidence. And he hasn't produced any, and he's tried. After the 2016 election, he made broad claims about millions of undocumented immigrants voting illegally that are completely unsupported. There's no evidence that it happened. He convened a commission of some kind to try to dig up evidence. They didn't come up with anything that was substantive or worth pursuing. And so, and he's continued to point to concerns about fraud that I think are unfounded. And why is this a problem? I guess it's a problem because it undermines confidence in our electoral system. It erodes it in a way that can be damaging. And it erodes it in a way, in particular with his rhetoric, that could actually lead to violence if taken far enough. Now, I'm not sure we're on the verge of violence. I haven't seen any reports of violence yet. I think we're still safely out of that zone at the moment. But it could go in that direction, if only because he has been stoking the fires of having a set of his supporters believe that there are problems with the system that have no evidence. And I'll stop there. I think I've spoken long enough and just sort of lay the groundwork where I think we're in a precarious situation. I think we have Donald Trump to blame for that. And I think it's taught me the importance of these norms that need to be, we need to be brought back to having both sides respect them more carefully.
Thanks very much, Quinn. We'll now hear some initial comments from Professor Kelly Patterson, and then some comments from Professor Richard Davis.
Kelly, you're on mute.
Boy, that like the phrase heard the most in 2020. Can you hear me now? Right. Sorry about that. You'd think an old man would know better. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. Fascinating elections. I hope all of the students out there are as excited and charged about this as they should be. It's monumental. It's an historic election on a variety of different levels. I've lived through a lot of them over my lifetime, and I can remember each and every one of them vividly, and it becomes sort of the rings in the tree by which you count your life and make sense of what has happened and what is likely to happen. To piggyback just briefly on what Quinn was saying about norms, I was on the latest updates that I have my computer continually refreshing, but they have these wonderful updates on the New York Times. And Mark Landler, who's one of the correspondents in London, said, in a shot at Trump, Simon Coveney, Ireland's foreign minister, said it would be unwise to claim victory before all votes counted. His UK counterpart, Dominic Raab, said the vote would provide a definitive result. So norms, these just aren't US norms. These are norms shared across Western democracies. And I think it's important to recognize that. I just want to throw two things out there for possible discussion and for people to consider. Given the one is, has the Electoral College outlived its usefulness? It seems to be becoming commonplace, or at least there's a high probability that in our elections we can have a winner of the Electoral College and a loser, and that winner of the Electoral College would not win the popular vote. And it's clear that the Electoral College isn't working as the framers intended. It's not quite sure how the framers really ever intended it to work. There's a lot of disagreement about that. But the point for us today is the Electoral College simply exacerbating the differences that we see occurring between some of these urban and rural areas, between flyover states and coastal states? And I think it's pretty clear that some of the angst surrounding this election hovered around this particular institution and the way in which it's designed. So that's the first issue that I'll throw out there that I think we should talk about. And the second has to do with something that Quinn hinted at, and that is that for constitutional reasons, elections are left up to the states. It's clear in Article 1 that the time, place, and manner of elections are to be left to the states. And in Article 2, the manner of selecting those electors is left to the states. Selecting the electors left to the states. But compared to our friends across Europe, we do democracy on the cheap. And we often overburden county clerks in the 3,500 to 4,000 counties across the United States and ask them to bear a tremendous amount of burden in races that have not just statewide consequences and not just national consequences, but international consequences. And we do that with often very little money. And I don't live in Provo. I live up in Salt Lake City, so it's slightly different. And I've never had a bad voting experience up in Salt Lake. But all of my colleagues that I talk to who live in Provo have had bad experiences voting in Provo or in Utah County. And we just haven't noticed it before because the results don't necessarily matter sometimes because it's just so overwhelmingly Republican. But we can see now that there are all sorts of demographic changes taking place across the United States that are going to demand even more and more from this obscure branch of public servants. And my plea is that we think long and hard about what, if we really want a political system that tells itself that it's democratic and accountable to the people, that we have to have really good procedures in place to make sure that that happens. And as a nation, we have not figured that out yet.
Thanks, Kelly. To you, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. This should be a good discussion. This could be the closest political presidential election since 1876. You know, it could be that the gap that separates the two candidates is 2 electoral votes. That's just amazing. That's an indication that we are, as a nation, very divided. This is in terms of the electoral vote, very close. The popular vote probably will be not as close as it was in 2016 or in 2000, but still, it will indicate that we have a nation that has divided itself into 2 camps, and it isn't just related to this election. It is related to a trend that has been going on for some time, that party has become the way in which people decide how to vote, but also how to see the world. Just as an example, this last month, there was a poll by NPR. Americans were asked whether Donald Trump's time in office was a success or a failure. 52% said that they thought it was a failure, but 91% of Democrats thought it was a failure. 93% of Republicans thought it was a success. You know, we have the same sort of record here. but the way it's seen is vastly different. And that has not always been the case. If you go back to the 60s, the attitudes about presidential approval, there was certainly a gap between Democrats and Republicans, but it was more like 40% gap. Now it's like 80% gap in terms of whether someone approves of the job of the president. And that partisan division has been exacerbated by the different narratives that we are exposed to as Americans. And that clearly comes from the media we choose to view, to read, to listen to. There's always been a partisan press that has existed. In fact, 200 years ago, it was a very strong partisan press. But now we have some niche news outlets that provide a very partisan frame to the events that occur. For conservatives, it's Fox News or it's the One American News Network. For liberals, it's the MSNBC or CNN. And the view of the world that you get is very different in those outlets. And an example of that is the pandemic that's going on right now. But certainly more than the pandemic. And that leads people to just see the world in very, very different ways, and that division again is exacerbated by the fact that people are getting and accepting quite different narratives about what is going on. And I wanted to throw that out as some explanation of why we have become such a divided nation, why we have these kinds of results that we do, and to pose, what can we do anything about that? Can we go back? We can't go back to the point where we had sort of three major news networks that provided pretty much a uniform look at the world. We can't go back to that. We have too much of a fragmented news environment for that. But the question that we have to pose as a nation is how can we bridge those divides? How can we deal with those divides so that we are not potentially facing this kind of division, which may lead to, likely will lead to lawsuits and possibly lead to violence eventually. So on that positive note, I'll stop.
Just a ray of sunshine, aren't you?
Yeah.
We all seem to be scattering sunshine this morning.
Like, wow. Like the rest of us are peddling hope here, and Richard's dealing the dirt.
Thank you to all of you for your comments. We have about half an hour for discussion. And the way that this will proceed for all of those in the audience is that I'll kick off a couple of questions for the panel. Panelists, I invite you to keep your answers short as short as you can, to a minute or two each. And if you have questions, if you could send them in the chat. Panelists, we're not expecting you to respond to questions in the chat, but I will try to aggregate some of those questions and pose them to you, and Professor Benfield will do the same. So we will be the voice for those questions, so you don't have to monitor that. But two questions for me to kick off. And again, for those of you that want to ask questions anytime, you're welcome to start sending questions through the chat beginning now. Two questions. Number one, I'm a comparative politics person, and I study democracy around the world. Many of the measurements that we use to try to determine what a good democracy looks like, or free and fair democracy, many of those measurement standards have indicated that the United States has been declining rapidly in those ratings. The Economist, for example, has now called the United States a flawed democracy rather than fully liberal democracy. Freedom House has marked the United States down in its measurements of democracy. And so question number one, would you agree with those assessments that we are becoming a worse democracy than we were maybe 10 or 20 years ago? And then secondly, I think one question that's on a lot of people's minds with respect to this election is polling. So for example, I saw an election eve poll that suggested that Trump was up by 7 points in Utah, but the electoral outcomes seem to suggest that there's a much wider margin than that. And that is replicated.
That was my poll.
Yes.
And Kelly's poll, just to be
That's
clear.
a cheap shot, man.
Yeah, ouch, ouch.
I think Quinn and
Go
I
ahead,
don't
Quinn.
answer any of these questions now.
I'll take that one in a minute. Sorry.
Yeah,
I
sure.
just gotta lick my wounds for a minute here.
So if you can make fun of our polling, Quinn, you're a scholar of the Middle East, right? Didn't you say you studied democracies?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, okay. So truth in advertising.
It's not a Utah specific thing, right?
No,
We've seen wide gaps in polling throughout this election, despite the fact that polling organizations have done their best to adjust to perceived errors in the last election. So I thought this panel would be particularly useful in weighing in on how we might interpret that. So those are the two questions we'll start off with.
I'll let Quinn start off.
All right. I'll answer your first question first by just saying, yeah, I agree that there is a decline of some kind. I don't know that I agree with all of the different ratings and so forth that are out there, because I'm not sure I'm intimately familiar enough with all of them to know whether I agree. But in the general sense that I think there's been some decline in American democracy, I think that's true. And I think going back to my opening comments, I think it has to do with, at this point, still mostly a decline in norms. We haven't done too much to change our rules. We've just been behaving badly at different levels. And it starts with the president and has escalated into the Republican Party in a big way. And I'll add that I say that as a Republican. I'm not criticizing the Republican Party from the outside. I'm a critic from the inside. I identify as a Republican. I have for a long time. And I'm saddened to see the party I identify with behaving badly on the national level, not so much on the state level. I don't see that in Utah yet, and I don't anticipate seeing it here. In terms of polling,
But
oh yeah, go ahead. You want to answer that the first question first, and we'll come to
I
the
want to
polling?
just jump in and say,
Yeah.
Quinn's right about the norms issue. I think that's really important. But a lot of these ratings that where we do not fare well as a democracy go back to the nuts and bolts of the electoral administration system, election administration system that I was talking about. And it's when I talk to my friends in other nations and tell them that most of our election officials are partisan offices, they're outraged or at least stunned. And this is because we haven't really, I think, grappled with what election administration being left to the states really means, especially in a broad, complex, sprawling democracy now, where you have these worldwide implications hinging on the decisions of a few county clerks in Wayne County or DeKalb County or in Los Angeles County. And once again, these are most of the time partisan offices.
Can I just point out too that Utah runs counter to this trend. So Utah is odd in so many ways, and it's odd in this way as well, and that we are a Republican-dominated state that has actually improved our election administration in the past decade in important ways. We've allowed for online voter registration that's fairly easy. We have same-day registration now that is fairly straightforward, and we have a robust vote-by-mail system that is run quite well. And that's all happened with a bipartisan consensus, with Republicans largely in charge of the state election system.
But the state legislators still don't like the Democratic county clerk in Salt Lake County.
They don't, but there are norms that restrain that behavior that are still followed. So
Yeah,
I
no,
would say that things in Utah go pretty well, and we're running exactly counter to the national trend in ways that I find fascinating.
but they go pretty well because we're not a competitive state.
Yeah, maybe that's part
And
of it.
so what you have is election administration becomes a partisan issue in many of those battleground states. And that's like Quinn and I have done research in Ohio, and those people have like 95% of their body is scar tissue from, the closeness of presidential elections over time.
The competitiveness of an election in a county or in a state when the elections office has bulletproof glass on the welcome and the reception area, like they do in Cuyahoga County, as Kelly and I can say with confidence. It's quite striking when you walk in and they have all the doors locked and bulletproof glass between you and the clerks behind the desk, and you think, wow, they must have had problems here in the past.
So going back, Quinn, I think the broader issue of these ratings is, are we somehow less of a democratic society than we were, I don't know, a decade ago? And my view is no. But I think there are rhetorical effects that are threatening. I think the president is the source of much of this, sort of threatening to do this, threatening to do that. And if indeed he had this come about, I mean, an example is declaring the election over before the election is over. Maybe thinking that if he just says it loud enough and long enough, it will happen. That is a threat to, but it has not actually, I think, played out in terms of a change in our processes, broadly speaking. That would justify those changes in ratings.
Should we talk about polling for a minute?
Yes, please.
Okay, so before we go down that road too far, I would say it's still a little too early to be sure how badly the polling did until we count all the ballots and assess it. But it is clear that it's going to be off in some way, and it's going to be off systematically, and it might actually be off more than it was in 2016. And I don't have an easy answer for that. There's a combination of things that make election polling difficult. Fundamentally, it's about estimating, pre-election polling is about estimating an outcome of an event for a population that doesn't yet exist. And so you have to figure out how to measure likely voters and then how to talk to them. And so there's a coverage problem with sampling from a group that you can't enumerate easily without some screening questions or some models or other things, and that's hard to do. And 2020 is an unusual election with an unusual level of turnout that makes relying on historical trends more difficult. So things could be systematically different with certain subgroups that make it. There's also potentially non-response problems. So if you get a good sample, then you have to get people to agree to talk or to respond, and there could be differential non-response that leads to error. I think that's, in my mind, that's the most likely suspect at this point, but that's very difficult to assess clearly, because if you don't talk to people or you don't survey them, you can't assess the error very easily. There are ways to get at that by using sampling from a voter file where you can assess the representativeness of your sample against the representativeness of the group that's on record as having voted after the election. And then there's a measurement problem that I don't think is a big deal, but it's been brought up in the press and other places, the so-called shy Trump voters or things like that. I don't think that's as big a deal as people make it out to be. I don't think there's a lot of systematic evidence that exists. But that's another possibility. Maybe we're just getting lied to, in other words. So we get the right group to respond to the survey. We sample the right group, we get them to answer, but then they just tell us things that are nonsense. They lie or they respond in ways that are inaccurate. I don't think that's happening systematically. I think it's a lot more likely to be the composition of the sample. and or the response rate and the differential non-response by different subgroups to the survey that's causing the error. But it's a really, really difficult needle to thread. And of course, Kelly and I have a outfit that we released some public polling with, and our polling estimate in Utah had the race at 7 points, and it's not going to be a 7-point race in Utah. It's going to be in double digits in some form, and we'll go back and assess the quality of that sample as we get to all the votes counted, and as we get a voter file in early December that tells us everyone who voted, and we can match that up and figure out where we went wrong. But it's a little too early to figure it out.
Closer in Arizona, and we never polled there before.
Yeah, exactly. We released a result in Arizona that actually is not terrible. It's actually pretty good.
Thank you very much for your thoughts on those two questions. I want to ask a couple more. And as always, you can choose to respond to what you'd like to respond to, and we'll keep it brief so we get as many questions in as we can. A few questions that are coming in that are related to the voting experience. We've heard some criticisms of that experience in the United States. So somebody asked the question, what about election observers? Would it be helpful to have international election observers? Should we have compulsory voting? Would that solve any of our problems? And also, how big of a deal is voter suppression in the United States? There's been a lot of talk about attempts to restrict people's ability to vote in a variety of ways in this election. And so the question is, what would any of you feel would be beneficial reforms to the electoral process that might enable our democracy to become stronger? And I'm going to pass this off to Stan, who's going to also follow up with a few questions.
Let me answer the question about election observers, particularly those who've been used in places where there is a history of electoral irregularities. Countries that have not had a history of a long history, particularly of fair and free elections. That's not true for the United States. I mean, unless you actually believe some of what Donald Trump says about this, voter fraud has been very, very low in the United States, particularly in recent years. So I don't think it would make any difference. In fact, there are election observers in the sense that people do come from other countries and watch our election very closely. But in terms of being there and making a report on, to the world about what it's like, that's not the sort of thing that would make any difference in the United States, because we don't have that history in the past.
Well, we've got an interesting history. Anybody familiar with voting patterns in the South will recognize that the United States has had a troubled history with voting and allowing certain groups to vote. And this is the whole issue surrounding the Shelby v. Holder Supreme Court decision that basically removes certain jurisdictions in the South from federal oversight. Used to be that in that southern belt of the southern states, anytime they made a change to their election laws, they had to get federal clearance from the Department of Justice for it. And that is happening less and less, which allows, the Supreme Court said these states don't have to do that anymore. And so this makes the possibility for mischief, and mischief is different than fraud, right? Fraud is where you actually are stealing ballots or dumping ballots, but mischief is making it harder for people to vote or confusing the voters. And we just don't have any really good, clear national standards on that. The only thing we have is an election administration commission, which came out of the debacle of 2000, and it doesn't have any really statutory authority. It simply is there to assist the localities as they conduct elections. So I know people in this, in this country don't like federal intervention, but at some point you've got to think about the ways in which you can make the voting experience uniform across states.
So let me just follow up with what Kelly said, because I agree completely that, and I think just to counter Richard a little bit from earlier, I think there is some signs that our democracy has declined, but it's piecemeal, and some of it comes out of the Shelby County holder. That's a pretty good example of sort of piece by piece, county by county, jurisdiction by jurisdiction deterioration. So if you're an election official and you have nefarious intent in terms of voter suppression, or a partisan that wants to engage in this, one of the things you can do that is perfectly legal until it's challenged and overturned by the courts is that you can allocate the polling locations in a county in a certain way so that it makes it harder for people in certain locations to vote. So let's say in this country, we live often in neighborhoods that are very clustered by race, and that's often very correlated with partisanship. So if you're a Republican that wants to suppress Democratic votes, you don't need to do so by throwing out ballots, shredding ballots as they come in and destroying things, but you can make it harder to vote by reducing the number of polling locations in African-American neighborhoods bit by bit and making the lines longer on election day. Or in a vote by mail or an absentee election, you can put your thumb on the scale by increasing the scrutiny you give to signature validation of absentee ballots in certain precincts that are known to be more democratic.
Or validated provisional ballots.
Yeah, and there's very good evidence that this happens. I think political scientists have spent a lot of time looking for this. This is not something I spend a lot of time on, but I see papers written and published that suggest this kind of stuff happens quite a bit, and it's happened for a long time. And there's some evidence that it's gotten worse in recent years. And so that's the kind of voter suppression that would occur. And I think we lost a control over that with the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County v. Holder, where we lost the federal oversight and the Department of Justice oversight. Now, under the Trump Department of Justice, that oversight may not have been very effective anyway, but it was there, and the career Justice Department of attorneys did a reasonably good job at policing that into the 2000s, and they made it hard for local officials to put up obstacles to voting, and a lot of those obstacles are creeping back up as a result these days.
And you've rightly differentiated between voter fraud, which is where you count people more than once, you count dead people, whatever, and voter suppression, which is where all of the processes are followed, but you can sort of manipulate the system in such a way. I mean, the first time I got involved in an election as a poll watcher was in a town in Georgia. There was one polling place, and it was located in the white section of the city. So African-American voters had to go to that area. That was clearly voter suppression. But that's not what Donald Trump has really been talking about. He seems to suggest that there's actual fraud going on where the Democrats are stealing votes in some way.
Quinn
We don't have evidence of that.
Quinn and I had the most remarkable experience of, we were doing some research on new voter technology when they were rolling out the new touchscreen voting machines, and we were in Ohio for that. and let's just say that it doesn't really make sense to deliver electric touchscreen voting machines to a gymnasium that has no electrical outlets or cords. And yet that's what we saw. And what we saw in Cuyahoga County was very different than what we saw in Franklin County. Franklin County's Columbus, Ohio, and Cuyahoga's
Cleveland. Yeah.
These are two different electoral jurisdictions that are run as if they were in two different worlds.
That goes to your point, Kelly, about how locally administered these elections are. I saw right before we started, I saw a notice that in fact there remain 300 votes that are uncounted in Wisconsin. And it's because of this small town. They can't find the county clerk who has fallen ill and no one knows where she is. And so they don't know how to count those final 300 votes.
And yet the Paris Climate Accords, right, could hinge on that. Right?
Well, it seems to, anyway, yeah. Well, we also have some questions. Let me bring up some questions here that people are not only concerned about these broader principles that we've been talking about, but also this this particular election, obviously, which is so unique for those of us who have lived through many of these. This is unique, but for many of, I think, our students, this is the first presidential election that they've been able to vote in. So maybe don't have quite the same perspective that we have, like going back to 2000, which Quinn talked about earlier. So one of the questions that has come in says, this isn't very creative, but just what do you think is going to happen? Is President Trump's move, or at least rhetorical advocacy of stopping the count, is that going to have any effect? Is that going to be positive? Anyway, what do you, not in terms of the result, but just in terms of how you think this will play out in terms of counting the votes, certifying the elections, and so on going forward?
I don't think it'll have long-term consequences unless he generates more national level Republicans to follow his lead. And thankfully, so far that doesn't seem to have happened. Even the vice president followed the president last night in speaking, and the vice president appeared to basically contradict the president's claim of victory within a few minutes of the president speaking. So, which has kind of been what the course for Donald Trump at this point. He doesn't seem to get Republicans don't always speak out against him, but they haven't gone along with him down this road yet. And so I'm still optimistic that this is a temporary blip and we can return to some sense of normalcy.
Thank you.
I'm just going to say, I think overall, as I was looking at all the election results, what I'm surprised by, we made a big deal out of this election because there seems to be such a big difference between the personality of Vice President Biden and the personality of President Trump. But in the end, all of the election results show that it's a pretty status quo election. That the House of Representatives, the Democratic Party expected to gain a lot of seats, not happening. They hope to take away the Senate from the Republicans, not happening. And there, but for a few tens of thousands of votes scattered across the Midwest, we'd still have President Trump. So while Richard's right, we are polarized. We've polarized ourselves into sort of this stasis.
Stalemate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could I just respond to Stan to what you said about students voting for the first time? So there may be a sense for those of us who have lived through this a long time, we realize elections come and go and presidents come and go, and the republic stands. But there may be a sense on the part of someone who is new to this that the world's going to fall apart if Donald Trump wins or if Joe Biden wins. And in fact, I heard James Carville, a Democratic political consultant, telling Democrats, "Look, put away the razor blades. Don't despair over this." He was saying that because he was saying it's going to be all right, meaning we're going to win. But I think you could say that even if you're not going to win, that still, life goes on, and again, the republic does not fall apart. It may someday, but it's not going to be because of this election. And as a result, you have you need to be calm about what's happening here and realize that that processes are going to play themselves out. And as long as we still have the opportunity to participate in the next election, and obviously some Republicans don't want that, lock them up it just is mind-boggling to me as a departure from American values, but it hasn't actually translated into real world policies, and that's great. So I guess the bottom line here is there'll be another day. The sun will come up, after, let's say, Donald Trump becomes the president again.
You really are a ray of sunshine.
What's that?
You're really a ray of sunshine. Started out talking about violence and despair and mayhem, and
no, I just said the opposite, Kelly. Everything's going to be okay.
I know. Ends up singing a tune from Annie. I mean,
Yeah,
I would offer. I agree with Richard on that. I think there's reason to remain optimistic and not be hopeless about things. And I guess what I would offer to students and others that are despairing over something that's happened at the national level is that take the long view. That there's a lot of time. It's important to be involved and participate in the national election and to think about it, but to not allow it to consume you. And then I would say the best advice I could give in terms of how to make use of your time and get involved in a way that would be productive is to turn your focus to the local level. That you can have more of an impact more quickly and distract yourself from whatever madness is happening at the national level that you can't control very much by turning your attention to the local level. And I reached back to grab a book off my shelf. We had a speaker from Civic Engagement, Eitan Hirsch, that talked about his book, Politics is for Power, How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism and Take Action and Make Real Change. I would recommend this book strongly to students that want to think about how to make a difference. So Eitan Hirsch, it's a great read and provides some motivation for how to think about getting involved in a way that's really productive. So if you're feeling a little bit despondent for whatever reason, pick a copy of that up and read it and think about, well, what can I do in my local community to be involved?
Great. Thanks very much, Quinn. And I think that is an interesting thing I've observed. I mean, all we talk about, all we seem to be interested in is the presidential election, right? But for most of us in our communities, the impact of our local political leaders, our local elected officials, in many ways may have a larger impact on us. So anyway, I appreciate everyone participating in this. This has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. Kelly, Quinn, Richard, very much appreciated. A lot to think about. Appreciate your perspectives. And seems like we have a lot of thank yous coming in from the students as well on the chat. So thank you for giving us some much needed perspective. Kelly?
thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Fun.
Thank you so much.